And welcome back, everybody, to Hands on Apologetics. And as you know on this show, we're always looking at cutting-edge apologetics. It's just really cool stuff out there, and there's so many people out in the field. And that includes our guest, who is Jake Busher, and he has a podcast ministry, which is called Cutting the Gordian Knot. And let me just give you some of the titles of some of the podcasts so you can get a feel for what he does, because it's really cool. All sorts of different areas of things that are strictly apologetics, and then there's things that you probably wouldn't consider in line, like Sell Your Organs, Save for Life, 3 views on politics, how your life together goes wrong. Let's see. What's wrong with Marxist philosophy? What's wrong with Marx's view of income inequality? The scriptural tour of Catholic Marian doctrines, gun insurance, how would it work? All sorts of really cool topics. And so, Jake, welcome to Hands on Apologetics.
Well, thank you. It's good to talk to you, Gary.
Yeah, I'm so glad that we made acquaintance, because it's such a cool podcast. I was going through it, and there's so much fun. I mean, you go from everywhere from theistic apologetics, analyzing, philosophical arguments, to, social issues and economics and things like that.
It definitely is a broad range of subjects, and I try to give the impression that there is something connecting them. So this is my best attempt. It's called Cutting the Gordian Knot, and that comes from the idea of Alexander the Great enters this city, and there's King Gordius, and he says anybody who can unravel this knot can, become the new king of the city or something. Very interesting political process they had set up. But nevertheless, he decides to solve this not by untying it, but by just cutting it. So it's this idea of out-of-the-box thinking, and it's in the context of rulership of some type. So you notice that we have the rulership of God, the rulership of truth. We have the rulership of government and in economics and in different types of life. So if I had to say there was a common thread, that would be it.
So what's your background? What got you interested in this stuff?
Oh, my goodness. I could probably answer that 100 very different and true ways how I got interested in these things. I'm a Catholic convert, so it began by answering a lot of these questions myself. I like to say that I kind of followed the Chesterton tract. He said that in his book Orthodoxy, that just when he was putting finishing touches on his own personal heresy, he discovered it was orthodoxy. So in large part, I found out, well, that's my story. Whenever I felt like I finally got a doctrine correct, that I was certain of it, and that it was new and novel, something different from what my Protestant friends and family ever espoused. When I thought I finally discovered something, I realized, no, I'm just not that original. It turns out the church knew it all along. And with time, I realized I could save myself a massive amount of work by just going to the source.
Yeah, right. So what is your background?
Oh, let's see. So, I'd say I did most of my learning as soon as I ended college, reading books, listening to podcasts like yours, I may add, and trying to think hard about issues that matter. And that's why I focused on my 3 favorite: philosophy, theology, and economics. As far as economics, most people struggle to see how it fits into that list. But to quote another person much smarter than I, Friedrich Hayek, he defines economics as the means to every end. And I'll add from Scripture that of the 4 sins which cry out to heaven for vengeance, 2 of them are economic. So apparently God cares about economics as well.
Exactly. Yeah. So many of us have this disintegrated view of religion. We think of religion as this thing we do on Sundays or holy days or whatever. And then there's rest of life, as if, it's disconnected from our belief in God, which is entirely different from the biblical worldview and the Catholic worldview, that all of life is integrated together. So, learning about God, learning about philosophy, learning about economics and things like that, all of it is intertwined, isn't it?
Absolutely. And it's not just intertwined academically, but it's also intertwined in our daily lives.
Yeah.
When we're told to worship God, oh, that's not just at Mass, that's all the time. I think it was St. Augustine when asked the question, might have been St. Thomas Aquinas, I don't know, one of those guys, when asked the question, how can we actually pray without ceasing? Because that is a biblical injunction. Well, he answered that we can instead just raise our hearts and minds to God in our action, even in our work, so that when we're working, that can become a type of prayer. And I think for most of us, what we do most of the time is some type of work. And that's not alien to the Christian life. It wasn't alien to Adam and Eve before the fall, but that's something that's core to who we are as co-creators, as God created us in the image of God. And Christ himself models this. Being on earth for approximately 33 years, he chose to take about 30 of those and spend them in relative obscurity, spend them working. Likely, many of those years were spent working with his father, Joseph. And some of those years could have been working after Joseph may have died. So just because we may be at work the vast majority of the time, engaging in, and I may add, is economic life, doesn't mean that that's at all antithetical to our call to be servants of God at all times.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And also, I believe that, our core religious views also affect how we live out things in terms of economics. It's not by accident that, for example, Marxism is generally atheistic, right? I mean, it's like, because there are consequences to those core beliefs.
Absolutely. In fact, I have an article that kind of gets into that, as you mentioned earlier, and I appreciate that. Every Mass, we say it is our duty and our salvation always and everywhere to give you thanks for your great glory. So that, to sum up the faith, you could do a worse job summing up the faith than that. Always and everywhere to give you thanks. So that is the core to the Catholic ideal. That's what we do in everything, whether we're working, whether we're at leisure. But with the Marxist thought, Marx says, to paraphrase, that we should instead look into the past to find the record of injustices against us. And he adds that we should foment purposefully a struggle of classes. Now we see that historically in economic classes, but we can see it today in other types of classes, religious, non-religious, male, female, races. It's sowing this type of division where there ought to be unity. It's sowing a type of envy and jealousy, when in place of that, the Catholic conception would give us thankfulness. So I'd say it's entirely antithetical, and it's no surprise that one results in flourishing and prosperity, and the other one results in abject tyranny and oppression.
Right. Yeah. There are big consequences to it. It's not just a personal preference, when it comes down to things like that, because if they aren't in line with how things truly are, then it's a train wreck in the end. It always is. And it's strange how many times we think that, well, maybe it's just bad people. Maybe National Socialism could have worked. It was just the Nazis were mean or something. It's like, no, it's defective to begin with. No matter who runs it, it's always going to run to the ground.
Exactly. The core question of economics, well, I guess there's a couple. One is the question of compared to what? Opportunity costs. Another one is, which way are the incentives pointing? And I suggest that that's something we always need to take into account. And when we have the incentive set up in a socialist or a communist or a Nazi system, I don't care who you put into that institution, you're going to get bad outcomes. And I think that, to paraphrase my favorite verse in all of Scripture, it comes from Sirach, and it says something like, "The compassion of the ignorant is cruelty." And I love that. That's just such a beautiful formula that we ought to have compassion. Christ had compassion, and we're supposed to do that, to feel what it's like to be others. But when that's paired with ignorance, the result can so often be cruelty. And I think there's a lot of people who have good intentions, who have been taught that the only way to be compassionate is to pursue these more Marxist ideals, and I think that's quite false, or to align incentives, which I think are ultimately destructive. And it doesn't matter if you just have good intentions. Everybody does. Every man is right in his own eyes. It matters that you can very intelligently put those things into practice with an eye towards incentives, so that we don't have cruel and unimaginable outcomes for typically the least of these who are most vulnerable.